Hello, everyone. Our names are Rachel Park and Katelyn Song, and welcome to a review of Chapter 2 of the Age of Sustainable Development and Unequal World. This chapter is about how we measure inequality through various means, including economic and happiness levels all around the world. Before we start, it should be noted that sustainable development is considered on the basis of economic development, wide-based social inclusion, or easy access to necessary resources for all people, and environmental sustainability, where the current generation would be able to fulfill their own needs and wants without depleting resources and opportunities for future generations. In order to do so, the most necessary thing is good governance. Governments have the most power to create change through policies and requirements for people and corporations, and technology is a long-term driver for economic development because it allows for more efficiency in the market.
This presentation will explain why the world we live in is an unequal world and how we measure such inequalities, but there are so many dimensions in which people experience inequality. We'll start off by learning about incomes around the world, move on to the disparities in urban and rural areas, then talk about income inequality within countries. After, we will talk about how to measure well-being and wrap it up by learning about convergence and divergence. We will then do a short summary.
Starting off with incomes around the world, the way we consider the income of a country is typically through gross domestic product or GDP. GDP is the total production occurring within the geographic boundaries of a country, typically in a year. So, for example, if the McDonald's in the US produced French fries, then the revenues would count towards US's GDP. However, GDP doesn't exactly measure goods and services produced outside the country's bounds. So although McDonald's originated in America, the revenues of their franchise in other nations wouldn't count towards US's GDP. However, some countries have greater populations than others, so it wouldn't be fair to solely rely on GDP to measure how well off people are in general. Therefore, we also have GDP per capita, which is the GDP of a country divided by the population. GDP and GDP per capita only measure production and not health and education of a population, but it's nonetheless a good way of measuring the average income levels of citizens living in a country. Therefore, with GDP per capita, we can split countries according to high income, middle income, and low income. The World Bank defines high income countries as a GDP per capita over $12,616 a year, middle income as between $1,035 a year and $12,615 a year, and low income as less than $1,035 a year. Now, throughout the past couple of decades, globalization has increased and people have been earning income from abroad. And although GDP per capita is the original measure in which we measure income, the gross national income, or GNI, also takes into account GDP and how much income people earn from abroad, making it more of a true measure to account for income levels. This graph makes it especially easy to visualize which countries are better off than others. And we can see that the low-income nations are generally concentrated around the tropical African and South Asian regions. We call them the least developed countries, or LDCs, and they usually have many diseases, less access to education, and social instability. Many of these nations are also unable to trade with other countries, which really limits their opportunities for economic development.
Next, let's analyze the inequality between rural and urban regions. In urban areas, people usually live in densely settled areas, so the population density is very high, and they typically work in the industry and service sectors. On the other hand, there is a very low population density in rural areas, and many people work in the agricultural sector. The income per person is typically higher for those who live in urban areas, and this is because healthcare is less advanced and accessible in rural areas due to low population density and people in urban and rural areas typically having different mindsets. For example, children are seen as workers in rural communities, but seen as expensive to care for in urban communities. Thus, fertility rates are much lower in urban areas. A trend that we typically see is that as the country becomes more economically developed, people tend to move towards urban life, and thus those working in industry and service sectors increase and people working in agricultural sectors decrease. This is why, through this graph, we can see that the richer parts of the world tend to be more urbanized. In the future throughout the world, the number of people moving to urban life is expected to continuously increase, whereas rural and agricultural life is expected to plateau and then decline.
Now let's look at inequalities that exist within countries. As mentioned before, GDP per capita measures the living standard of an average individual in a country, but income inequalities can also exist within countries. To measure this, we use the Gini coefficient, which is done on a scale of 0.0 to 1.0. 0.0 represents complete equality, whereas 1.0 represents complete inequality. 0.25 is typically seen as an equal country, and anything above 0.4 typically shows large amounts of inequality. Now, there's many factors that may create this inequality, such as history, geography, and the governmental system in a country. One of the most important factors is education, and young people who are able to obtain a higher education are also usually able to translate their higher education into higher income levels. However, it also follows that wealthier people typically have more access to quality education, and those in urban areas are usually able to seek higher paying jobs. Racial, ethnic, gender, and religious discrimination also exists within the educational setting and the workforce, and this may make it difficult for marginalized groups to obtain education and higher paying jobs. At the beginning of this review, it was mentioned that governments are crucial in driving sustainable development goals, and this falls especially true when we look at the gap between the upper class and the lower class. Governmental policies are absolutely crucial in minimizing the income inequality within a country, and if a government can use their revenues to ensure widespread access to education and healthcare, it can really narrow down income inequality and raise economic efficiency.
Moving on to measuring well-being, it was also mentioned before that GDP isn't able to take into account things such as education or the health of a population. This is where the Human Development Index, or the HDI, comes in. The HDI provides a more holistic account of human development by considering income per capita, educational attainment of a country, and indicators of health such as life expectancy. Interestingly, some countries are considered high income in terms of GDP per capita, but rank lowly on the HDI, and vice versa. Another measure of well-being similar to the HDI is the Cantrell ladder. This measures subjective well-being as people are given surveys and are asked to place themselves on a ladder with 10 rungs, with the top being the happiest life possible and the bottom being the worst life possible. This indicates the general satisfaction that a population has in society. Interestingly, although many high-income countries rank highly on the ladder, some middle-income countries were the ones to rank the highest. The results help to indicate that income and social capital are important to one's happiness, but physical health, mental health, and values of individuals and societies also play a large role in happiness.
Now, moving on to convergence or divergence, one of the goals of sustainable development is that all low-income countries should at least make a transition to middle-income status, and that the inequalities between different countries should be lessened. Economists use important terms for this. Convergence describes the narrowing of a proportionate gap between a poor country and a richer comparison country, whereas divergence describes a poor country becoming even poorer when compared with a rich country. The reasons why some countries have developed, whereas others stayed poor, will be looked at in detail in the Chapter 4 review.
Overall, in this presentation, we looked at the different ways in which we measure inequality. GDP and GDP per capita allow us to look at varying income levels throughout different countries, but even within a nation, disparities exist between rural and urban regions, and the Gini coefficient allows us to look at how much inequality exists within a country. To account for inequality in terms of factors other than solely production, we can utilize the Human Development Index or the Cantrell ladder. All in all, we hope you enjoyed learning about this topic, and please contact the Center for Sustainable Development if you have any questions.